All right, folks, we're going to get started. And on behalf of the 22 members now of the Congressional Freethought Caucus, I want to welcome everyone to this briefing on how Christian nationalism is threatening reproductive freedom in this country. I see that I'm joined by my co-founder and co-chair, Jamie Raskin. And the way this is going to go, folks, first I need to let everyone know we are recording this Zoom briefing. We may post some or all of it online, so please let us know if that is a problem, but I wanted to make everyone aware of that. I'll say just a few words here at the top, then hand off to Congressman Raskin. Our colleague Sean Casten is also expected to be with us, and so if he arrives before we get into the panel, we'll let him have a few opening remarks. And then Jamie Raskin's going to introduce our panelists, and we will take it from there. For my part, I just want to start us off by noting that if there is a silver lining to this cruel and ignorant Alabama Supreme Court decision that frozen embryos are children, human beings, the silver lining is that this decision and a subsequent interview that Chief Justice Tom Parker gave is so openly rooted in Christian theology and the Christian nationalist agenda that it opened a window for the country to talk about it more openly and candidly, and even the mainstream media to talk about it in some cases for the first time, and for people to see what's beginning to happen in our country. It's obviously a good thing that news networks and newspapers are covering this extreme belief system and ideology that drove this decision, but I noticed that even that coverage kind of missed the bigger picture. They described Parker and his Seven Mountain Dominion ideology as some kind of an outlier, as if it was so weird and extreme that it's just a matter of time before other courts or the legislature steps in and fixes it, and we won't have much to worry about just from this extreme outlier. I think that's dangerously wrong from everything I've learned about this movement, and we'll hear from people that know more about it than me today in this panel. The Christian nationalist agenda and the Seven Mountains Dominion movement that Parker openly embraces is not an outlier. This is the belief system and the political agenda of judges throughout the state and federal judiciary. It's the belief system and ideology of elected officials all over our country, from local government all the way to Congress. It's the belief system and ideology of our Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and of dozens of our congressional colleagues who proudly embrace this dangerous ideology, and they act on it every single day. Trump's inner circle is filled with proponents of extreme Christian nationalism, and they have some pretty chilling plans that they've cooked up for Donald Trump's second term if he gets it. So the Freethought Caucus is going to keep sounding the alarm and spotlighting this because the implications are a lot bigger than just Alabama. We, the Freethought Caucus, were the first members of Congress to warn of Christian nationalism as a threat to our democracy and national security. And we are convening this important briefing today to highlight how Christian nationalism is also threatening reproductive freedom. So thank you so much for our outstanding panel today, for my colleagues who are joining us and for their staff who are either joining us now or will see this briefing. And I'm going to hand things over now to my co-founder and co-chair of the Freethought Caucus, Congressman Jamie Raskin, for his opening thoughts.
Thank you, Jared. You are a credit to the Constitution and the living spirit of the founders and the Enlightenment. So thank you for your fantastic activism on it. And we're delighted to be joined by so many great people on the Hill and off the Hill, and these terrific speakers. The Alabama decision really must be read in order to fully appreciate how thick the theocracy is, and how, there are dozens of invocations of God. There's the discussion of incurring the wrath of a holy God if we don't engage in a particular kind of interpretation of the statute and the Constitution. And so it is indeed everything that we've been talking about. And I wasn't quite sure that we would be living in the Handmaid's Tale so quickly, but it's starting to feel a lot like Gilead around here. We have with us today some terrific panelists. Kelly Baden, who's the Vice President of Policy at the Guttmacher Institute, which is such an amazing fountain of data and information and facts about reproductive health. Heather Weaver, the Senior Staff Attorney for the ACLU Program on Freedom of Religion and Belief. Catherine Stewart, whose book I have read, which I recommend highly to all of you guys, called The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, which is right on point for where we are right now. And the president of Catholics for Choice, Jamie Manson. So we're delighted to be with all of you. And I think we're launching right into the questions. Is that right, Jared? We're not giving them any talking head time, right?
I think they were each, Quentin, correct me if I'm wrong, I think they were going to make a short presentation and then we were going to do questions.
Is that right?
If you want to ask some of the opening questions, then I think each.
Okay, good. I think we're going to get into it through the
Well,
questions.
let's take that prerogative, Jamie.
I've got the first question and it's directed to Kelly. And Kelly, I'm hoping that you could give us some sort of mental picture of reproductive rights in America today, red states, blue states, purple states, you know, how to conceive of the geography of reproductive freedom. And then specifically, what is the role that white Christian nationalism plays in the state of the law across the country?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you to the Congressional Freethought Caucus for today's important discussion. As you noted, I'm Kelly Baden. I'm with Guttmacher Institute. We are an action-oriented think tank committed to advancing sexual and reproductive health and rights worldwide. So right now, almost not quite 2 years after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, the context is as follows. 14 states are enacting near total abortion bans, while numerous other states have implemented bans on abortion early in pregnancy, such as 6-week bans in Georgia and South Carolina, 12-week bans in Nebraska and North Carolina, and other abortion bans and restrictions in effect throughout the country. Research by my colleagues here at Guttmacher have shown some of the high cost of those state abortion bans. Right now, nearly 1 in 5 patients are traveling across state lines to access legal abortion within the formal healthcare system, often at great financial and logistical costs to themselves and their families. Meanwhile, state legislatures show no sign of stopping their relentless assault on bodily autonomy, even in states where they have already banned abortion. As of March 1st of this year, more than 2,500 provisions related to reproductive health and rights are pending in state legislatures. Nearly 500 of those are additional abortion restrictions of some kind. And while there are strong efforts in many states where abortion remains legal to continue expanding access to abortion care, the ongoing threats from state legislatures and courts, including the Supreme Court, show us that anti-abortion extremism is alive and well, and its goals, as we know, go well beyond abortion. They include attacks on contraception, now attacks on IVF, of course, the harmful and devastating attacks on trans and gender nonconforming young people and their families. And they're even trying to target your ability to help someone navigate their state's abortion ban and leave the state for abortion care, or even aiming to limit your own ability to freely travel across state lines for healthcare. So we know the Dobbs decision was not their endgame, and all of our rights are at risk, no matter which state that we live in. Anti-abortion extremism and Christian nationalism occupy seats of power, and there are groups specifically organizing to use state legislatures as sites to enact those extreme agendas, aiming to advance copycat laws that seek to limit our personal decision-making power and further blur the lines between church and state. There are more than 7,000 state legislators in office in the country, a mixture of part-time, hybrid, and full-time state legislatures, gerrymandered districts, restrictions on voting rights, and a reduction in state house news coverage, and this years-long well-funded project to infuse fundamentalist conservatives into state elected offices to advance a religious agenda. So it is no surprise that many state legislatures do not in fact reflect the will of the people. So this clear mismatch between what Americans want when it comes to respecting our reproductive rights and needs versus what state legislatures are doing is very much in part due to the overwhelming influence of extremists in positions of power in states. Thank you.
That's a sobering overview, and I'm going to take the next question. Jamie, and I see Sean Caston has joined us. So after this question and answer, I'll hand off to Sean for any opening thoughts or questions that he might have. But I want to bring it over to Heather from ACLU. And Heather, I think a lot of Americans were shocked by just how overtly religious the reasoning in Chief Justice Parker's concurring opinion was, how it ran completely counter to the constitutional separation of church and state. And he not only defended his ruling in his subsequent interview as biblically based in its definition of life, but he went on to openly advocate for a Christian theocracy in that interview. And of course, that's what the Seven Mountains Mandate is all about. Why is church-state separation so important for people who care about reproductive freedom?
Yeah, thank you. And good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Heather Weaver. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm with the ACLU National. So in answer to your question, I'll try to give a bit of a legal perspective here, but before I get to that, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So let me give you a little background about the opinion you just mentioned. The Alabama Supreme Court recently ruled that embryos used for IVF are children under state law. And the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, Justice Parker, wrote a separate concurring opinion that could be characterized as a religious creed of sorts, where he argued that the state constitution requires courts to respect, quote, the sanctity of unborn life, end quote. And he argued that this provision must be interpreted by reference to the Bible and religious doctrine because the word used in the state constitution, sanctity, is uniquely religious. Now, that might have given another judge pause to say, if that's true, that is itself a violation of the separation of church and state. But Justice Parker, in his opinion, doubled down, and he made clear that the IVF ruling was nothing more than an attempt to impose the religious views of the justices and some Alabamans on everyone else. And as you know, in subsequent interviews, he even doubled down again, I don't know what quadrupled down, I guess, to say, yes, this is exactly what we intended, and this is the basis for our ruling. Now, in theory, even with the reversal of Roe v. Wade, which was rooted in the 14th Amendment, the separation of church and state should be all we need to protect our reproductive rights. Under the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, the government is not supposed to enshrine religious beliefs into law. And as we all know, objections to abortion, contraception, IVF, and other reproductive rights, as we saw in Justice Parker's opinion, are almost always based in religious beliefs about when life begins, and also particular religious views about the role that women should play or should not play in our world. I wish I could just stop there, but of course, that's not how church-state law has played out. In practice, unfortunately, the federal courts at least, have generally rejected Establishment Clause challenges to restrictions on reproductive rights. In 1980, for example, in a case called Harris v. McRae, the US Supreme Court upheld federal funding restrictions on abortion, you may know that as the Hyde Amendment, and said that just because the restrictions may coincide with religious tenets, it does not, quote unquote, without more, violate the federal Establishment Clause. Of course, it was pure fiction to suggest that the Hyde Amendment was not motivated by specific religious beliefs and was not an attempt to use the government to impose those beliefs on others. But nevertheless, that's where the court came down. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Heather, even if that was a fiction, we certainly have the more now. Whatever the Supreme Court meant in Harris by without more, surely a Chief Justice of a state Supreme Court admitting that the outcome of the IVF case is dictated by the Bible qualifies. Surely state lawmakers across the country who have been brazenly open about the Christian grounds for their various restrictions on reproductive rights and their intent to impose their religious views on all people is sufficient. And I would love to say that it is. But when it comes to the separation of church and state under the US Constitution, at least, I'm sorry to say that it might not be enough. As you probably know, the Supreme Court has been looking toward, reversing Roe v. Wade, it also has been slowly but surely eroding the wall of separation between religion and government. In recent years, the court has allowed explicitly Christian prayer at government meetings. It's allowed the government to display a 40-foot Latin cross. It's required states with school vouchers and similar programs to fund religious schools, even if the funds will be used for religious activities. It's undermined non-discrimination protections for women and LGBTQ people. And just days after the court reversed Roe v. Wade in another case called Kennedy v. Bremerton School District, which you all might know as the football coach prayer case, the court overturned a key church-state legal doctrine that had prevailed for half a century. That doctrine, called the Lemon Test, was what allowed courts to actually take into account lawmakers' motivations to impose their religious beliefs on others and to examine whether certain laws did just that in effect and say, no, that's unconstitutional. It was not a perfect test, but it did reinforce the principle that the government must remain neutral when it comes to matters of religion. So in 2022 in Kennedy, the Supreme Court, they abandoned that test and they replaced the Lemon Test with a test that requires the Establishment Clause to be interpreted by, quote, reference to historical practices and understandings, end quote. And if that sounds familiar, it's because the court purported to apply a similar history and tradition test in overturning Roe, where, just like in the recent Second Amendment case, the court cherry-picked facts from history and manipulated them to reach the outcome that it wanted. So should Chief Justice Parker's opinion violate the Federal Establishment Clause? Should the reproductive rights restrictions we're seeing in states across the country, openly justified by resort to religious views, be unconstitutional? Absolutely. And it's our most fervent belief at the ACLU that these government actions are a profound infringement of the separation of church and state as protected by the US Constitution. But I'm sad to say that we can't count on the federal courts right now to see it that way. So that sort of brings me back to the original question, is like the relationship between separation of church and state and reproductive rights, and where does that leave us? And I don't think we are abandoning all hope. There are many state constitutions, some of which will provide additional church-state protection, and there's some cases out there that are challenging abortion restrictions on those grounds. Second, I think one thing we can really continue to do is to spotlight and reinforce in the hearts and minds of the American electorate and the public the importance of the separation between church and state as a fundamental American value and principle that undergirds all of our most cherished rights, from religious liberty to the equality of all people to reproductive freedom. People don't always realize how intersected these rights are. And in the area of reproductive justice, the Christian Nationalist movement, as we've just heard several times already, is not going to end its fight with abortion or IVF. They're going to target birth control. They're going to target other contraception. We know that they're going to target other rights outside of the reproductive justice context, other healthcare as well. So, what they really want, what the Christian Nationalists want, what I think the majority of the Supreme Court wants, is to normalize a world in which separation of church and state is no longer a big deal. They want it to become a relic or a footnote to American history, along with the core rights that we know are tied into it and dependent upon a strong church-state separation. And so, it's important that we keep raising this issue up, talking about it, and really educating the American public about why we can't let that happen.
Thank you for that, Heather. I'm going to hand off to our colleague, Sean Casten from Illinois.
Thank you. I don't know that I have anything great to add. I guess, on questions of constitutional law, I defer to people like Jamie and the folks on this phone who know it way better than I do. I wonder if any of you can help me understand the religious doctrine at play here. Like, there was a time when Christian theology was sort of agnostic on abortion. How did we get to IVF, and what does that actually mean? I mean, are we on the verge of, a fertility clinic doctor who's, separating out fertilized embryos being charged with murder? I mean, where does that go? Where are they trying to get it to? And from a religious theology perspective, how did it ever get there?
Jamie, do you want to take that? That seems like it might be in your wheelhouse as Catholics for Choice.
It is, yeah. I didn't know if we wanted Catherine can tell you about the whole trajectory, but in terms of the
maybe you two could team up on it.
Yeah, I'll say just quickly in terms of the theological reality, the Catholic Church since the late 19th century has taught that life begins at conception. And so for that reason, the moment the sperm hits that egg, according to the Catholic Church, that is life. And any destruction of that is akin to homicide. And so it's this theological idea, ultimately, what is the point? The point is to control women, make sure that they are, that their primary vocation is motherhood. That's really what the long game is there. But that's why it's so concerning, this ruling about IVF, because it really is, the Catholic Church is the only religious group that has this position on IVF. A lot of religious groups like evangelicals, Mormons that are more high demand actually have encouraged IVF. So that's how we got here. And I think that it has become just a powerful force. And Catherine can say a lot more about how the abortion issue was adopted from a uniquely Catholic issue to being embraced by evangelicals to become this potent, motivating religious force. That's how it started. And the problem, I mean, there are a lot of scientific issues with it, namely that 60% of fertilized eggs naturally wash out of the body, and these are people that are claiming this is God's natural process. Now, if that's God's natural process and it's murder to destroy these fertilized eggs, then why would God create a process that would create such supposed homicide? I mean, these are the questions that our religious traditions just don't reckon with, and they have just used these as political talking points to push forward a far more nefarious agenda. And that's where I'll just pivot to Catherine for that.
Wait, Jamie, forgive me. What percentage did you say wash out of fertilizer?
Scientists say 60 to 80% actually will naturally wash out of the body before it implants. Pregnancy can only happen when that fertilized egg or the embryo implants into the lining of the uterus. That could take up to 2 weeks to happen. But what the Catholic Church is saying is the moment the sperm hits the egg, it is life, and any destruction of it is akin to homicide.
And just on this point, on the IVF point, I think they're now split. I mean, we know what their political motivation is to run away from the implications of their actual position, but some of them are saying, well, that even if the sperm and the egg meet, if it hasn't implanted in the wall, it's not a life yet. And then others are sticking with kind of the classic doctrine that life begins at conception. And is there a theological dispute going on about that?
Not in the Catholic Church. No, certainly not. I don't know. This has never been an official evangelical doctrine, so they can get a little loosey-goosey with it as it politically is expedient for them. But in terms of Catholic theology, no, there is no discussion.
Yeah. Theologically, Catholics have been pondering these deep questions for many, many years. Evangelicals are just realizing that the dog caught the car, and theologically, they don't know what to make of it. Is that fair to say?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, this is, Catholics have been talking about when a pregnancy gets a soul, they call it ensoulment, when it becomes life, for centuries. And there have always been disagreements among theologians about it. And again, the Vatican only adopted this belief that life begins at conception in 1869. And this happened around the same time the AMA was pushing to become the American Medical Association discrediting midwives. It happened around, then not long around the Comstock and what he was trying to do, because he was very concerned about the rise of abortion rates and the use of abortifacients, very publicly. So it's all sort of happened around the same time.
I just want to add that, what's interesting about the IVF decision is that the Republican Party still depends on the votes of a significant number of people who don't quite get this and who are really keen on IVF. They're disproportionately older. Many of them are Republican. They tend to be wealthier than the average parent. So they don't like this and they're going to make it stink. But even though some religious right organizations like Liberty Counsel have hailed Judge Parker's decision, some Republican politicians are really trying to backtrack on what they stated previously and make a carve out for IVF, even though they have previously supported bills that would make IVF impossible and that would have outlawed certain forms of birth control. But it's interesting what they're not making a carve out for. They're not making a carve out for 11 and 12-year-olds. They're not making carve outs for rape victims or women whose pregnancies are putting their life and their health, including their mental health, at risk.
Jamie, did you want to go next? I have one ready if not.
But I'll go after you, Jared.
Okay. I want to circle back to Jamie again, because we all know that there are fundamentalist Catholics who totally share Justice Parker's view on life and IVF. One of them was given a special award at CPAC last month. But we also know Catholics who don't share these extreme views. And that goes for not just IVF, but abortion, contraception, other reproductive rights. Could you speak to this disconnect between how the majority of religious people, or Catholics even specifically, feel about Judge Parker's extreme views?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And again, just thank you so much for inviting me. Again, I'm Jamie Manson, president of Catholics for Choice. We've been around 50 years. We encounter, educate, and embolden the majority of Catholics and people of faith who do support reproductive freedom. And I'm very grateful to you, not only for having this session, but also for inviting a person of faith here. Yes, the threat of Christian nationalism is significant. And it is not just posed by evangelicals. On all matters of sexual and reproductive ethics, whether it's IVF, abortion, miscarriage care, women's equality, LGBTQ equality, the Catholic Church hierarchy is one of the main drivers of implementing theological ideas into law. They have invested millions of dollars into electoral campaigns, like Ohio's recent Issue 1 campaign to enshrine abortion rights into the state constitution. They use their parishes and their pulpits to organize and mobilize, and they have wielded power and infiltrated the Supreme Court. The greatest evidence of that is that every justice that overturned Roe v. Wade either identifies as Catholic or was raised Catholic. They commit profound spiritual violence against those who are they're supposed to lead. They weaponize the Eucharist against Catholic populations and specifically Catholic politicians. We think it is, and the majority of Catholics agree with us, it is spiritual violence for the church to tell women that their main goal in life is to raise children and then shame and stigmatizing them for seeking fertility treatments. It's a subtle and insidious way that religious leaders are trying to create a Christian nation that is anything but Christian. They have a narrow-minded and oppressive gender norm that comes with their false interpretation of the Christian tradition and Christian scriptures. The good news is that while the teaching does and has changed, as I said earlier, on many matters of sexual and reproductive ethics, there is one belief that Catholics hold dear that supersedes all of these lesser teachings, and that is the Church's teaching on conscience. Even the Catechism of the Catholic Church states that in all that we say and do, we are obliged to follow faithfully what we know to be just and right. So in all matters of sexual and reproductive health, most Catholics inherently recognize the value of individual conscience in their decision-making. And that means they consistently make the decision that is right for them, regardless of the Church's teaching. And that's whether it's IVF, abortion, divorce, marriage equality. The truth is the majority of Catholics support and utilize IVF. They support and utilize contraception. They support and they utilize abortion. As Guttmacher, that's a great statistic from Guttmacher, 1 in 4 abortion patients in this country identifies as Catholic. 63% of Catholics think abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And only 8% of Catholics agree with this idea of the bishops that life begins at conception. If we can speak directly to the faithful, we can counter this Christian nationalist framework that these so-called religious leaders are trying to establish as a norm. In a country like the US, religious freedom must encompass both the freedom to practice your religion, but also the right to be free of the religious beliefs of others. We have to counter these narratives, though, not just with secular language and arguments, but also with faith-based language that shines a light on an alternative and equally faithful perspective. I know that criticizing religious leaders and beliefs can be very tough to navigate for elected officials. That's why Catholics for Choice is here to help you walk that line of faith-based values while upholding that core value of religious freedom.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jamie. I can't imagine the kind of pushback that you've had within your church community. There was a time when the Catholic Church would have done some pretty violent things to a heretic saying the things that you're saying. So I applaud you for your conscience. And Kelly, did you want to add anything from the data side to what we just heard?
Just echoing Jamie's point, I actually dropped the citation in the chat here so folks can have it, but we do have a 2020 report that show that people of all faiths and religion want and need and use contraception and abortion in large numbers. So the details are in that citation.
Great. Let me see if either of my colleagues have a follow-up question. Jamie, yeah.
Thank you, Jared. Yeah, I wanted to go to Catherine Stewart to ask the question. It's really a two-part question, I suppose. One is about what is going on within Republican Party politics now to create a marriage between the official GOP structure and the fundamentalist movement. And then related to that, what are the theological rationalizations or justifications being generated to explain what Donald Trump's role is? I mean, even a non-believer can recognize he's not the most pious and devout and religiously motivated man. Fortunately, he's not, at least explicitly, on our side. But how are they explaining the whole movement wrapping itself around a man who's definitely much closer in reality to the Antichrist than to the Christ?
Those are great questions. So I'll sort of start with the last question. We have to remember that this isn't Christianity, or at least it isn't Christianity as most people understand it. We're looking at an extremely reactionary political ideology that exploits religion for politics and power. We can call that political ideology Christian nationalism. In the Alabama Chief Justice Tom Parker's case, we can call it Seven Mountains Dominionism, which we can get into a little bit later. But first, I want to talk about how is it possible that this movement supports Donald Trump, a man, this is a movement that claims to stand for family values, and he hardly embodies those values. They compare him to a biblical king like King David or King Cyrus, an imperfect ruler through whom God chose to enact his will. Well, here's the thing about kings. They're not the kings of democracies. He sort of represents the authoritarian, I would say, longings and authoritarian characteristics of this movement, which is, as I mentioned, radically anti-democratic, holds the principles of pluralism and equality and justice that undergird our democracy with contempt. And, it's a very identitarian movement. They use religious nationalism to promote this idea that there's a we under threat, a they that we hate, that we're in an apocalyptic struggle between absolute good and absolute evil. And therefore, sort of all the gloves are off. All, methods are legitimate in order to sort of vanquish this existential threat and restore America to its proper, the way it's supposed to be. And, so Trump becomes a kind of perfect representative of this identitarian movement. He is, he shows no respect for other people. He says, with his speeches and gatherings, he says, he characterizes people, anyone to the left of him, as demonic, or, many of his representatives refer to their political opposition as satanic, not people who, are loyal opposition, but people who really are seeking to destroy America. And so, he appeals to this identitarian thing. They're happy with someone who wants to crack heads as long as those heads belong to their political enemies. But I want to get back to sort of the role of religious nationalism within this movement. And I think we can look at somebody like Tom Parker and his Seven Mountains Dominionist beliefs to illustrate that. He subscribes to this ideology, Seven Mountains Dominionism. He has ties to something that charismatic evangelical networks, which is known as the New Apostolic Reformation. He's a key proponent of a form of Christian nationalism called the Seven Mountains Mandate. Now, this political ideology is incredibly anti-democratic. According to Seven Mountains Dominionists, Christians should dominate what they call the seven mountains of influence, which includes the category of government, business, education, media, entertainment, religion, and family. Now, let's be clear. When they talk about Christians, they don't mean anyone who identifies as a Christian or goes to church on Sunday. They mean those who espouse an extremely hardline form of the faith melded with a hardline form of partisan politics. It's really exploitation of religion. When they say they wish to control those 7 mountains, they don't mean they want to give their religiously inflected opinions on public policy. They really mean they have a God-given mandate to impose their worldview on the rest of us through law and policy, using the full force of the police and military powers of the state if need be. So the IVF decision is a pretty good illustration of how it works. The Chief Justice opens his Bible, and somehow he finds in it a commandment that thou shalt treat a frozen embryo as if it were a living child. There's no space for alternative interpretations in Christianity or any other faith. There's no sense that people with different but equally sincere beliefs, with or without religion, might have their rights too. But if you dig deeper, it's really about the money and power, and not just about reproductive rights. Hostility to reproductive rights is accompanied everywhere with an embrace of far-right economic theory and a rejection of rights and protections for the workforce. So the attack on IVF is really just one piece of a much larger pie of controlling people's rights. We should obliterate any illusion they're going to stop with abortion or bans on forms of birth control. It stops with total dominion, where their explicit doctrine is that they and they alone should control every aspect of our government and society. It's really about the destruction of democracy. So how is this movement come to be so close to the GOP? Well, 2 decades ago, 7 Mountains Dominionism was considered so extreme and fringy, right? It was never allowed near the podium with Republican political leaders. And today, that very same ideology is really a heartbeat away from everything that happens in the Republican Party. Even many of those who do not themselves identify as charismatic evangelicals, they might identify as Catholic. I think about people like Roger Stone and Mike Flynn. I think about Mike Johnson. Yeah, the sort of language and ideas of the 7 mountains have kind of infused and a lot of their thinking. And sometimes they, work with people who are 7 Mountains Dominionists, or they have a sort of spirit warrior language. So they talk about spiritual warfare, use certain Bible passages that end up being a kind of, are very often used within that movement. Major religious right gatherings, strategy gatherings sponsored by big groups like the Faith and Freedom Coalition and the Family Research Council. They used to have values voter summits. Now it's called Pray, Vote, Stand. They now feature 7 Mountains themed breakout sessions and panels from the main stage. So this movement is getting ideologically harder and hotter and more extreme every way as it moves into the future.
And in terms, Catherine, that's helpful to understand how extreme it is. How seriously should Americans take it? Because, I mentioned at the top that some of the news coverage suggested, well, Justice Tom Parker's just a quack. He's just a nut. But a few weeks ago, a couple dozen of our colleagues went over to the Bible Museum and did an altar call with some of the craziest apostles and prophets of this new apostolic reformation. All 7 Mountains theology was just oozing from that event, and they all were there for it. I think this is way more widespread than most of the country currently understands. Do you disagree?
I agree with you. These ideas have really infused so much of GOP activism. Are you familiar with the Reawaken America tour? It's a sort of traveling pro-conspiracy, pro-Trump conspiracy roadshow. They set up every month, sometimes a little more frequently, sometimes a little less, in megachurches around the country. Look, Trump is the Republican frontrunner. His most trusted allies, including members of his own family, some of his sons, show up at, one of his sons often shows up at these events and speaks. Mike Flynn, who is, Roger Stone, who he worked with for years. These are Trump's most trusted allies, and here they are spreading every conspiracy imaginable. I mean, you go into those spaces, I've attended 3 of them, and you hear every kind, don't let them microchip you, COVID conspiracies, a lot of medical misinformation, a lot of talk about the great replacement, talk about demonic portals and one world government. I mean, it's just sort of like every conspiracy is out there. You can sort of pick and choose, but the overarching conspiracy they promote is the conspiracy that the 2020 election was stolen, and Donald Trump is just portrayed as a savior. There's a lot of art in those spaces. You'll see Trump, picture of Trump with a sort of young Arnold Schwarzenegger's body and an eagle here and Jesus over on the other side. And there's a lot of religious nationalism. They bring in a lot of these pro-Trump pastors. There's a group called Pastors for Trump that has participated in a lot of these events, and they claim to have, thousands of members. So, I think the destruction of the idea of truth is really critical to this movement, because this movement knows if you can separate people from the facts, it makes them easier to control. And if they'll, believe in a lot of weird, conspiracies, they will believe in the big conspiracy that the 2020 election was stolen and Donald Trump is here to save them.
Sean?
You guys are all making me scared. So I want to come back to the IVF question I was asking before. We were doing an event after the Dobbs decision. I think Catholics for Choice, or certainly Men for Choice, was involved in it. And there was one of the speakers I thought made the compelling argument that she said that, she had gone through IVF and then had to have, I forget the term of art, but basically had too many fetuses inside her and had to have a reduction. And as she described her sort of process through abortion, she said it was God's will that I not have children. So how is it possibly against God's will to have some children? And I just share that because I'm and as I said at the start, I'm not a religious person, but if you push that envelope too hard, is there a religious pushback against IVF as a principle that's driving this, because somehow IVF is not God's will, or is it just that once you've used IVF, all of those embryos need to be subject to equal protection? Does that make sense?
I would love to respond to that if that's all right. We have to remember that the sort of, I would say, a pro-life religion, as it were, is a modern creation, and it was created for political purposes. You can't look for logic in the IVF decision, because they're going to try and walk that back in some ways, because a lot of very well-off people that they want the support of are going to object to it. But we have to remember that, they will try and separate it out from abortion. Abortion was created in order to unite the movement. It brought together conservative Catholics, a sector of conservative Protestants, which the Republican Party, the time Roe versus Wade passed, most Republican Protestants supported it, but they sort of made it the issue, because they know if you can get people to vote on a single issue, you can control their vote. So I expect we'll see a lot of illogic trying to justify the IVF thing. Although I think the movement will be divided on that. We're seeing some of the right-wing policy groups hail the IVF decisions, or say we really need to look, carefully at the theology of this. And then you have a lot of other politicians realizing that it's, political dynamite. So does that help?
Anyone else?
I'll just note that, I don't know if everyone's aware, but Alabama did pass a law, or the legislature passed a law that was signed into law by the governor last week, that basically provides immunity to IVF providers for the death. I use the word death, not literally, but liberally, of embryos through the IVF process. It doesn't actually address the underlying issue of whether or not an embryo is considered a person, but it does shield them from liability for now. So I think what that speaks to is that the fact that, this is actually even a controversial decision within the religious community. And we're seeing, it's really highlighting the fractures, the fact that this is not necessarily one monolithic, even in the evangelical community, it's not monolithic in terms of the views about IVF. And I've seen a lot of interviews of just people walking back their religious objections to it once they realize, or their religious objections to the just the whole concept, or just to their walking back their position that an embryo is life once they understand the implications for IVF. So this has been interesting. It's an interesting test of some of these communities because they're not as close-knit in terms of views as some people might have thought.
Katie Britt, in her acting class speech the other night, seemed to put some distance between herself and that decision as well.
I think we saw a big scramble of anti-abortion politicians at all levels, really over the course of that first week after the decision, line up in very different ways around this decision. Ultimately, of course, mostly coming out against it, including Donald Trump on the Friday after the decision. So I think, again, speaking to the broader realization that this was perhaps not as politically popular as they thought, even though we know that already abortion bans are not politically popular, and that has not stopped them. And I would just underscore Heather's point that, yes, the state did move quickly to enact some kind of law that does protect IVF, sidesteps the larger questions, as you noted. And a few similar bills were introduced in other states around the country, I think, in response as well, including states that have total abortion bans like Missouri and Kentucky. They haven't moved yet there, but I think it speaks again to this kind of a desire to try to grasp some degree of or minimize the political loss that they're experiencing now.
But it also highlights, to Catherine's point earlier, the lack of reason or rationality. If you adopt the position that Jamie mentioned as to what you think an embryo is, this is the sort of outcome if you're going to enact that into law. And so Catherine's completely right that we can't necessarily depend on sort of rational thought, thinking through the whole process as to what it means down the road. It's really so much, it's the positions on these issues are just so much more complicated. Like they're both simple and both so much more simple and both also much more complicated than you initially would think.
We have several leaders from secular groups on this briefing. Let me open it up and invite them to ask any questions they may have of our panel.
Jared,
Yeah,
before
please.
you do, I'm going to have to go, but I would love it if one of our distinguished panelists would just opine as to what the best way is to keep track of what's going on with white Christian nationalism. Is there one centralized website, or do any of your groups follow it more closely than the others? Just because I imagine in the campaign season, it's going to get increasingly crazy what they're saying, and we just want to stay on top of it.
Anybody have the pulse of this Christian nationalist operation?
From a journalist point of view, there are a number of wonderful writers who are producing books, articles, following these issues very closely. I don't see one place that they're all aggregated, but there are a lot of just wonderful voices out there and terrific journalists who are following the issue from that point of view.
And I would just add the Americans United for the Separation of Church and State is a really excellent resource for keeping track of this.
We work very closely with them, and I agree with you completely. Let me see if, I certainly welcome questions from our friends at secular groups, so let me see if the panelists may have questions for each other or other things that they would like to add.
I would love to add, just briefly, you asked earlier if folks should be scared. And I wanted to, kind of point the spotlight again on state legislatures. And I think they are, relatively speaking, more inexpensive to win a seat in a state legislature than elsewhere. And so you can get, a lot of kind of bang for your buck, so to speak. And so these very concerted efforts by groups like the National Association of Christian Lawmakers, right, like are very, very intentional and very transparent about their goal of using places like state legislatures and other elected offices to enact, what they call biblical worldviews. And so I think we historically on the progressive side have been not as focused on building power in state legislatures as conservatives have over the last decades. And I think this is a real area to know that an everyday American really can have some power. You can have access to your state legislature. You can organize locally to make sure that your state elected representative is more in line with your community's views than being pushed by some big national shadowy right-wing organization.
And Sarah Levin points out correctly that Right Wing Watch, if you don't follow them on Twitter, you really should, but they do a great job. Now you're going to get more than just Christian nationalism, but on Christian nationalism, they've got a special thread to show you some of the most outrageous antics of, the Greg Locks and Dutch Sheets and other luminaries of this really scary authoritarian movement. And you will be in a perpetual state of concern if you follow that thread, as you should be. All right, well, if there's nothing else, I want to really thank this excellent panel. Sean, do you have any closing thoughts here?
No, just to thank you all so much for doing this, Jared. Thanks for organizing. Appreciate all of you being on the front lines and leaning in on these issues and doing the right thing.
And I will just maybe close with one more question that occurs to me. We in this conversation have highlighted the incredible intersection between the defense of reproductive rights and the threat of Christian nationalism as a driver of the threat of against reproductive rights. How do we make more people in the reproductive rights movement aware that so much of this threat that they are fighting is coming from Christian nationalism? Or maybe do you think they already get it? I'm just wondering how much work we have to do and what light we can shed on this.
I think in the run-up to the 2024 election, we should really emphasize the importance of the courts. I would go to these right-wing conferences in advance of, say, the 2016 election, and a lot of speakers would say, this election is about judges, judges, judges. And I don't really see that sort of emphasis all the time from the other side. And I think people within the reproductive rights community understand that, Roe versus Wade just didn't happen by accident. They said they were going to end it. They ended it. And then they said, look what we did. We ended Roe versus Wade, and we're proud of that. So I think that if we can sort of help people to understand that our courts are at stake, that would go a long way to sort of helping to save our democracy.
I would add to that I think that my colleagues in the reproductive health rights and justice movement absolutely understand the Christian nationalist threat, and that's what is rooted in. I think there is always the U.S. is a very religious country, and it is very hard, I think, for secular organizations and even political leaders to criticize religious belief, because people do get very offended very quickly. And the right wing is very good at exploiting any time you hint at criticizing people of faith. And so what I have been encouraging my colleagues in the movement to do is tap into the people of faith who do support IVF and contraception and abortion rights, because we are the majority. We have to dismantle this false narrative that you can't be a faithful person or religious person and support IVF, contraception, abortion. It's a false narrative, and it's really, really effective talking point for the right wing. And so that is what I've been encouraging them to do, is center faith voices. Because we are the ones that can take back the narrative. We are the ones that can speak in the language of faith to them, and dismantle these false claims that they're making and this disinformation that they're spreading. So that is what I think, and we are in a position at Catholics for Choice, we can criticize and critique religious people in a way probably secular actors can't. And so to really lean into the opportunity that we present by doing that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jamie. I don't think it's entirely fair that secular actors are somehow deemed to be second-tier voices in this, and that only the religious can criticize the religious. But I think you're kind of right in terms of the perception and the politics of this, and that's why we really appreciate this interfaith coalition that we have to come at this together.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, folks, thanks so much. We will post potentially some or all of this online and make it available to others, but you have really helped our Freethought Caucus and the staffers and members who will benefit from this conversation understand things better. And we'll look forward to working with you again and being part of future events together. Thanks, Sean, for joining us. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks to our great panelists. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.